Okay, so what Hobbes wants to do now is he wants to establish a true philosophy. So how are we going to do that? We're going to set this thing on a scientific footing. Um, we're gonna really be trained in this. So we're gonna go back to Plato, and this requires experience and it requires training. So science is going to come into play because there's nothing that is innate. There's nothing that we know a priori. There's nothing that's just born into us. We have to learn everything and its consequences. So what we need to do is we need to find out exactly what these things are that we give terminology to. So we have appetites and aversions, we have good and evil, we have deliberation and will, and we have felicity, and we have power. And appetite and aversion are really it's just those things that sensory stimulation that leads us to those things that we move towards and those things that we move away from. Well, appetite is those things that we want, aversion is those things that we don't want. And so we're really working on the idea of those things that are pleasurable to us and those things that are painful to us. So that's really kind of how we're doing that. Passions, as an instance of endeavor, is the small beginnings of motion within the body of man before they appear in walking, speaking, striking, and other visible actions. So those are already in your mind. Hopefully, we'll come across. I have to remember where I put it, but I'll send you a video clip that's very similar to the appetites and aversions, and I will mark that as appetite and aversion. But that's that thing that prompts us to act. So there's no, it's just something that's happening. Why it's happening, that would be really interesting, and that's the thing that David Chalmers says is really the hard problem, why that happens. So Hobbes is going to assume that human beings are motivated by the same types of passions, and they're directed at different objects and different people, but we can formulate some definitions about passions that would be applicable to all human beings in general. So good and evil, obviously, since the state is going to define this, there is no such thing as this overarching principle of good and evil. So subjectivism will rule the day, but we're not going to have anything. What we're going to call good is those things that we have an appetite for, and those things that are evil that we have an aversion for. And he will say, but whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he, for his part, calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil, and of his contempt violent and inconsiderable. For these words of good, evil, and contemptible are never used with relation to the person that uses them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves, but from the person of the man, where there is no commonwealth, or in a commonwealth from the person that represents it, or from an arbiter or judge whom men disagreeing shall by consent set up and make his sentence the rule thereof. So it's subjective. Plato and Aristotle are going to say no, that it is absolutely an overarching principle. Very bold claim, makes everything relative. There's no such thing as intrinsically good or evil. They're always going to be relative to your desires, and if we can't find that, we have to assume that the arbiter or judge is now going to make decisions for you that are truly based on the good for you. So you're now giving up your power. And I ask people, one of the questions, I believe it's in your book, that says, is there any time in your life that you would give up freedom for peace and security? And it's interesting, a lot of people will. And Hobbes thinks that if you're truly self-interested, you will. That's an interesting proposition. Deliberation and will. Deliberation and will are interesting because really it's just, your appetites and aversions are directed at the same thing. For example, I have an appetite for chocolate. I want that chocolate. I want cake. But I know it's bad for me, so I might fluctuate between desire and aversion. And so, what is will? Well, it's actually when I am going back and forth, and will is just when I take it. When whatever it kind of ends up on, that's will. Deliberation is going back and forth. So I'm going to take someone's pencil. I'm going to take it. I'm not. I'm going to take it. I take it. That's will. Okay. They're not. It's not a voluntary act. It doesn't mean free will. There's kind of a rigid determinism in here as well. Felicity, this is a state where we get this long-term happiness. So if we're in a war of all against all, there for Hobbes, there's no such thing as the idea that we're wrong in warring against each other. There's no idea of fair or unfair in that. Instead, it's just that's the state of nature. But once we establish a commonwealth, then we do have good and evil, and that's when we get it. Let me stop here and I'll do the next.